All right, well, hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar, Equity, Not Equality, Practical Racial Justice Strategies to Increase Awareness. Our presenter today is Miss Veronica Parker. She serves as the coordinator with the California Adult Education Technical Assistance Project. In addition to her role as coordinator, Ms. Parker is a doctoral candidate at the USC Rozier School of Education, studying educational leadership with a concentration in urban education. Ms. Parker's research includes examining how theory transfers to classroom practice in social justice-oriented teacher preparation programs, how partnerships with grassroots organizations improves access and outcomes for learners, and how collective critical reflection at the systems level is salient to improving organizational culture and commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ms. Parker comes to the diversity, equity, inclusion space from a unique place that has been shaped by her lived experiences and perspectives. Ms. Parker's values include love, equity, compassion, empathy, community, collaboration, accountability, patience, and growth. Please welcome Veronica by saying hello in the chat box. And if you have any questions during her presentation, you can submit those into the Q&A box. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Veronica. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And thank you all very much for joining me this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are in the United States. As he mentioned, my name is Veronica Parker, and I am a coordinator with the California Adult Education Program, as well as a doctoral candidate with USC Rozier School of Education. And you have joined me in the Equity, Not Equality, Racial Justice Strategies to Increase Awareness webinar this afternoon. So I'll go on to my next slide. And as was mentioned, my background and how I am situated in this work. And just to dive a little bit deeper, so as the coordinator with the California Adult Education Program Technical Assistance Project, we have 8 statewide priorities, with equity being one of them. And so I am working with my colleagues at the CAP Technical Assistance Project to keep the conversation going about equity. So that's part of my why. As to why I am here this afternoon. I traditionally present this presentation with my colleague with the Outreach and Technical Assistance Network, Netta Anasari, but she cannot join us today. She is busy planning the Technology and Distance Learning Symposium, which will take place next week. So if you're familiar with OTAN and want to learn more about technology, go to otan.us and register for that conference. So additionally, my why. So I, of course, am a Black woman. I attended public education from pre-K through my bachelor's degree, and have never had an instructor that looks like me or even understand who I was and the marginalized communities I grew up in. So I'm very passionate about this work and because of my experiences, and I'm passionate about creating change in public education. And I want to preface this by saying I am by no way an expert. I'm just here to share with you what I've learned from my lived experiences and from my study over the past few years in the Rossier School of Education program. So again, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I see in the chat that a lot of people have started to introduce themselves, so thank you so much for introducing who you are and where you come from. It's great to see everyone from different parts of the world joining us this afternoon or even morning if you're here with us on the West Coast. So we talked a little bit about what this presentation is about. I'm sure you all have read the description, but one thing that I want to emphasize here is that this is an open space for brainstorming, collaboration, and inspiration to adapt learning environments to enhance adult student achievement, with an emphasis on learners from traditionally underrepresented backgrounds. So thank you so much for joining. And we're going to get started today. And I have a question for you. So I see everyone has accessed the chat and you are familiar with how to use it. So I have a question for you. Why did you choose to attend this session today? That's one question. And then what are you hoping to get out of this session today? I want to make sure that, I, of course, have an agenda and I have my presentation and my talking points, but I want to see what you all are interested in learning about. So in the chat, if you could just let me know, what you hope to get out of this session, I would greatly appreciate it. I haven't seen anything just yet, but I see, okay, Laura mentions many of the faculty I lead have trouble differentiating between equality and equity. Thank you so much for that, Laura. We will touch on the difference between the two. And to enrich knowledge and delivery of DEI issues, equity is a top priority for me. I am interested in tools for expanding understanding and bridge building. And let's see, David says, I get credit for credentialing, and I am curious about what people define as equity. Is it different for each person? Okay, that's a great observation. And Amy says, I'm interested in learning more about being inclusive of all my students. We have many students of color in our program. Thank you so much. And Lynn states she joined in order to be better at equity. We are really working on bringing out more for our diverse students. Okay, great. And there's plenty of other comments in the chat. So as participants, definitely go ahead and look at some of those reasons why people are here. And I'll be sure to get a copy of it as well, because as I'm expanding this work, I want to make sure that I'm touching on areas that are important for people. All right, so next we're going to cover our agenda. So in this session today, we're going to talk about equity, not equality, and what does that mean? We're going to go through a brief timeline of the historical context of racism in education. That's just to frame the session and to really talk about how we got to where we are present day. And then I'm going to present some adult education data from the state of California, and then talk about ways in which you in your respective contexts and within your state and district can look at your own data in order to examine where there is overrepresentation, underrepresentation, and some of the ways in which you can look at your practices and be able to use data to support. And then we're going to look at some current practices, and then we're going to look at some practical racial justice strategies that could be implemented. We're going to look at racial justice strategies from the individual perspective. So us as educators, how we could be mindful of ourselves and our own practices. And then we'll look at some organizational practices that you can take back to your organization and be able to implement if you so wish. And within the PowerPoint that will be sent to everyone tomorrow or within 24 hours of this session, you will have live links to websites and resources that I use to put together this PowerPoint, as well as some of the documents that you'll see on the screen. You'll have access to them and you can adapt them for your own use. And then increase awareness and inspiration to enact change. So that's our agenda for today. Now, before we get started, I always start my presentations by setting norms. And so these norms that you see here listed on your screen, they're from John Singleton's 2015 Courageous Conversations About Race text. If you have not seen that text or read it, I definitely encourage you to access it. But the 4 agreements or 4 norms are: stay engaged, speak your truth, experience discomfort, and accept non-closure. So for staying engaged, what we mean is it's a refusal to let your heart and mind check out of the conversation while leaving your body in place. It is a personal commitment each person makes regardless of the engagement of others. It means remaining morally, emotionally, intellectually, and socially involved in the dialogue. And when it comes to speaking your truth, we all have a story. We all have experiences that have made us who we are today. And so speaking your truth is knowing it's only part of the truth. So you bring your authentic self into the conversation, honor and respect each other's truth, and experience discomfort. So talking about race, racism, and inequity is often uncomfortable for all of us. And so identifying and unpacking our own identity groups and the different levels of privilege associated with them is even more uncomfortable. So to engage in these conversations around race, racism, and equity in honest and meaningful ways, we ask participants to agree to experience the discomfort. We often call it sit with the discomfort. And then accept non-closure. So there is no quick fix to or to-do list or solution to the complex problems posed by racism and inequity in education specifically. We are not going to solve every problem within our organization or even within this group today. However, we do get the opportunity to commit to an ongoing dialogue and a journey of growth together. And so as I close these norms, I want you all to remember, like, we are in this together. That's why we're all here in this space this afternoon. So now that we know what the norms are for our time together, I want us to engage in a brief meditation exercise. So this is an invitation, and I invite you all to participate. So it's an opportunity for us to create a brave space by engaging in a brief meditation. So the invitation is titled An Invitation to Brave Space by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. Mickey Scott Bay Jones is a justice doula, is a social justice advocate who wrote the poem as part of her work in bringing healing to others. As we enter in the space to do this work this afternoon, we must center our heart and our intentions. So at this time, I ask you to close your eyes, take a deep breath, and hold it. And then count down from 10 and let out a deep sigh. So I'll demonstrate. So with your eyes still closed, listen as I recite Mickey Scott Bay's poem. Together, we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we all have caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together. And we will work on it side by side. So as we open the space as a brave space to do the work, I invite you to select a word or a phrase from the poem that will be your intention for our time together and type it in the chat. And Francis, I see your question. Yes, this will be a part of the PowerPoint that you'll receive. And so I see brave, side by side. We all carry scars and we all have caused wounds, grow, side by side, amplify, turn down the volume, start somewhere, amplify, brave, responsibility. Okay, great, great. Yes, thank you. And remember your intention as we move through the rest of today's session. Thank you all very much. So next, and remember, I'm still framing the work that we'll do this afternoon together, but one thing that I want to point out is that there will be some shared vocabulary. So the shared vocabulary that is linked in this presentation is provided by Generosity. And so it provides a list of different terms that will be used throughout this program, throughout this webinar, or that you may have seen or heard or even used in your own context. And so it just provides an opportunity for us to be on the same page when we're talking about this particular topic. So some of the terms that are in this particular shared glossary are ally, equity, anti-racism, equality is in there. So there's a list of different terms that, again, it creates a shared vocabulary for all of us. So I want everyone to have an opportunity to be able to have this. I'm going to actually post it in the chat, a link in the chat. And so everyone has a link to the shared vocabulary. So as I'm mentioning different terms, you all will know exactly what I'm referring to. So now we'll go into the actual session. So I'm sure many of you have seen this particular image, or you have seen an image such as this one. And so we want to break down what equality and equity are, and then what true liberation means, which is what we are working towards. So equality means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. Equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact same resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So in adult education specifically, learners are from diverse backgrounds. And when we're addressing matters of equity, we must center their unique situations, their lived experiences, and their cultures in order to provide them with equitable access in our adult education programs. But also we must center systemic issues that have discouraged adults from participation in and or completion of adult education, and which may have caused them which may have caused the system in its entirety to leave racial and ethnic groups underrepresented and underserved. And so when we talk about the systemic issues, if they are not centered, we run the risk of deepening past injustices and create and increase economic marginalization of people, populations, and communities of color. And so in order to reach true liberation, everyone, every adult, every educator, et cetera, in our adult education system will have what they need in order to be successful. So not having a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather having an approach where we are truly understanding and meeting the needs of our adult learners. So here are two images that you all may have seen at some point, particularly in the summer of 2020. So although the media attention surrounding the heinous murder of George Floyd and others have in a way died down. It's not as prevalent in the media at this time. Our communities, in particular our learners, are still experiencing injustices at the hands of those who vow to protect and serve, or who vow to provide equal access to systems such as education. And these systems were designed to support learners, in particular, who face adversity. So I want you to keep these images in mind, or other images that you've seen, kind of what I've shown previously. Keep it in mind as we are discussing some of the ways in which we can implement practices, because although it's not prevalent in the news at this particular time, our learners are still experiencing these injustices on a daily basis. So now we're moving into the historical context of racism in education. And so here's a quote on your screen provided by Kendi in 2016, and it reads, "Racial discrimination was stamped from the beginning of America, which explains why racial disparities have existed and persisted. Racial discrimination led to racist ideas, which led to ignorance and hate. This is the causal relationship driving America's history of race relations." And so keep this quote in mind as we go through a very brief overview of the historical context of racism in education. And then we'll reflect on some of the elements, and I'll present some of the timelines. And I want us to reflect on it because it helps us to understand why we experience some of the same inequities from 200 years ago to present day. So the perpetuation of inequities in education stem from not addressing the root causes. And up until this point, the system has not taken a holistic approach to address the educational and social needs of learners. Instead, our educational system continues to perpetuate ambiguity, related to the root causes of disparities. And according to Bishop and Dr. Pedro Noguera, the equity efforts must address the educational and social needs of all learners. The historical context of education tells us that not only has the system not met the academic and social needs of learners, the system has not provided access to design, practice, and resources needed to achieve equity. So next, I'm presenting a timeline, and this was taken from The Education of Blacks in the South between 1860 and 1935 by Anderson. So when Thomas Jefferson first articulated the relationships between popular education and free society, he expressly excluded the education of enslaved children, being that peace, prosperity, and civilization depended on the containment and repression of literate culture amongst its enslaved population. And between 1830 and 1835, it was a crime to teach enslaved children to read and write. By 1860, 5% of enslaved people had learned to read, even though it was considered against the law. By 1865, 14 Southern states had established 575 schools for 71,779 Negro and white children in regular attendance. But in 1866, the Freedmen's Bureau closed all Black schools under their authorization. Again, whenever there was a higher attainment for education, when it was a threat to productivity or to the economic system, education was taken away from those who were enslaved. And next, I present a timeline provided by the Education Trust West that explores some federal and state laws that shape the educational opportunities or lack thereof in social conditions faced by Black children in California. So a couple of highlights I would like to mention today, and again, you'll have access to this timeline for your reference. But for example, in 1852, although California was considered a free state, the state barred Black children from its public schools. In between 1930 to 1950, as part of the Great Migration, California's Black population exploded by 500%. But in 1947, California legislature repealed school segregation and paves the way for Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. However, in 1974, the US Supreme Court prohibits desegregation across district lines, causing resegregation as white students flee to affluent districts. And so I present this information just to highlight a few, very few moments in time from the historical context of education. There are so many points in time where there were blatant injustices in the public education system. So I invite us all to become more familiar with the history, to deepen our understanding of how we got to where we are today, how to understand some of the root causes in order to enact change in the education system. So I do not present this information to present just another slave story or a deficit narrative, but for really for us to pause and really reflect on how we got to where we are and how we continue to perpetuate some of these same cycles in our education system. So next, here is a quote by Bettina Love from 2019. And so I will read it and then we'll just sit with it for a moment. So to even begin to attack our destructive and punitive educational system, pedagogies that promote social justice must help educators understand and recognize America in its schools as spaces of whiteness, white rage, and white supremacy, all of which function to terrorize students of color in particular. So again, we just want to sit with this because these are some of the issues that we'll have to unpack in order to really work in a space of growth and to enact change in our system. So next, I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about some data for the state of California to again frame this particular conversation. So on your screen, you see some data points, and these data points we're taking from our adult education pipeline system, and it's adult education data for 2019-20 for the state of California only. And so in 2019-20, the state of California served close to 800,000 students, with the vast majority of our learners participating in the ESL program area and of Hispanic ethnicity. However, when you look at the below statistic, so it's the 60.9% socioeconomically disadvantaged and enrollment, those data points are taken from the California dashboard. So we see here that more than 6 million students in the K-12 systems, but close to 61% of them come from socioeconomic disadvantaged homes, meaning they are eligible for free or reduced price meals or have parents/guardians who did not receive a high school diploma. Now, the California dashboard does not break this number down, at least public facing, does not break the 60% down as to free and reduced price meals and disaggregate parents without a high school diploma. However, I use this information just to demonstrate the need, especially in the state of California, that when you're looking at this data, and we examine the number of adult learners in our ABE and ASC programs, the percentages it demonstrates a need, because if we have 61% of our students who come from families who are eligible for free or reduced price meals, or have families or parents and guardians who do not have a high school diploma, we have adults in our state who could be participating in our adult education program. And so we ask ourselves, why are more adults who could benefit from our ABE and ASC program areas, or even our CTE program areas, to learn a trade to potentially increase their livable wage, not participating in adult education? And so the invitation to you all is to, if you are not already, or if you are, examine your data closely and identify areas in which you can see a need for either a particular group of individuals or a particular program area, and work with, let's say, your K-12 systems to bridge the gap where our adults, our parents, are taking advantage of our adult education system. And so again, this is just to provide, to frame and to provide context as to demonstrate what the need is, and to also talk about some ways in which we can look at our own data. In our next slide, this is a table taken from California WIA titled Title II Federal Table for 2017-18, and it shows participants by entering educational function level, ethnicity, and sex. And here again, we see similar populations in our ABE and ASC program areas across certain ethnicities. So whenever, especially as you're planning your program years, make sure that you're looking at your student data to see where the need are. And then also take some of the data that you are seeing and look at your policies, look at your outreach efforts, look at your professional development, et cetera, to see how you can attract more adult learners in your region, in your community, who could benefit from your adult education program, and see where you can attract them into your program. So the next slide, like I said, thinking about opportunities. So adult education, some of the questions you can ask yourself is, who are your current students? So your ESL students, your ABE, your ASC students, your CTE students. And then think about, what are you doing as an individual, as a classroom, as an adult education agency, as a system, as a district? What are you doing to teach your students about equity? What about your colleagues, your instructors, your leadership? How are you centering equity and using it to create an inclusive space with your students in mind? And then also think about, is adult education really diverse, or is there a need to increase diversity in your adult education system? And here are just some different uses of data that we use. So our CASAS data tables, our Launch for Adult Education Pipeline data, as well as census data, to truly get at what the need is and how we can be responsive and create those inclusive environments. And then also think about what instruments you're using, such as funds of knowledge, and even culturally responsive teaching surveys, in order to increase your awareness of your students. And we do have the annotation tool in webinar. So utilizing the annotation tool, which should be in your bottom bar, it should say annotate. You should be able to use the annotate to mark some of these statements on this slide. So here we're going to, you can use the annotation tool, or you can even type in the chat some of the ways in which your agency or district is addressing equity currently. So for California, for example, we're looking at our data, but one thing that you can think about is, does your agency or your school have an equity and diversity team, again, present at your agency or district? So if you do, use the annotation tool to mark that. Do you look at ethnic data tables in your system? If so, use the annotation tool to mark that. Based on what you know about your student demographics, are your outreach practices, are they meeting the need of your students? And are we aligning our outreach practices? And then lastly, we're talking about different plans. So your program improvement plans or your strategic planning efforts, do they include an equity component? So I'm going to look, I don't see anyone using the annotation tool. Does everyone see it at the bottom of their screen? Can you annotate? No, we don't have it. Okay. So in the chat, could you type in the chat if your district or agency is engaging in any of these different practices? So is there a DEI team at your agency or district? Do you look at your ethnicity data? David says maybe at the state level. Laura says, yes, we're including equity as an overlay filter for our program review process. Okay, great. Leah says, scrolling up, the chat is moving. Thank you so much. Hold on one second. I have to turn off the annotation tool for me. So Leah says, DEI team, yes, population demographic data review. Michael says we could do better. Peg says the DEI department. Vina says there's no DEI team. And Diana says outreach is based on local ethnicity data. Okay, great. And can anyone tell me what has been some of the outcomes that you've seen based on these different practices that you've implemented? Okay, and Krista says the fact that I don't know says a lot. Peg says inclusive materials. Okay. Okay, and then Laura says they've begun to look at disaggregated data, culturally responsive instruction, increased level of awareness activities. Okay. Okay. Lynn says she's not sure of the outreach practices, meeting the needs. We seem to be lowering the number of times available instead of raising. Okay. Cross-cultural dialogues. We have navigators for outreach to our communities. Okay, great. So there are some practices going on within your respective context. And again, this is just to give you ideas to be able to go back to your respective agencies or districts, campuses, et cetera, to be able to start thinking about or using some of the tools available to you. All right. So next we're going to go into talking about positionality. And so when we talk about positionality, we're talking about who we are and how we fit into different elements based on our gender, race, class, sexuality, ethnicity, culture, language, and other social factors. So this is one of the strategies that I personally like to use a lot myself. And with that, it comes down to pausing with intention to critically reflect. And so when I'm doing that, I'm looking at the ways in which I show up. So what my identities and roles are, occupations included. Do I hold? What privileges do I hold? And when did I become aware of them? When did I first recognize my ethnicity or race? How have I been marginalized? And thinking about my life choices, why did I make the decisions that I make in my organization? And so I offer you an opportunity to pause with intention to critically reflect on an ongoing and routine basis. That is one way in which we can all continue to grow within, because the work truly does start within. Although we have our systems that creates inequities through policy, through funding, through hiring, et cetera, how we show up and where we come from, and how we speak our truth, et cetera, that also will help us to grow. And that's a racial justice practice that I use, is pause with intention to critically reflect. And like I said, these are some of the questions that I offer you all to engage in, to again, pause and critically reflect. And there are so many questions that you can ask yourself, but remembering your positionality and pausing with intention to critically reflect will definitely help you. So now that you've seen some of these questions, what are some questions that resonate with you that you would like to pause and critically reflect a little further, a little deeper? So if you can type in the chat, what are some questions that resonate with you? Number 3, how it played out in my family. Okay, thank you, Laura. Number 2 for Dr. Zachary. Nice to see you, Dr. Zachary. And what privileges do I hold? What privileges? Number 2, and actually let me go back, sorry. Number 5, so thinking of life choices, okay. Number 2, privileges. Number 4, how have we been marginalized? Okay, so I'm seeing across the board all of the questions that you all would pause and reflect on. So I definitely offer you to sit with these questions and continue to really dig deep within self of how these questions impact you and how you show up in your educational space. And I'm going to go back to my presentation. All right, and so we just talked about that. So I'm going to move forward, and becoming an anti-racist, like I said, starts with knowing thyself. So like I mentioned before, pausing with intention to critically reflect, analyzing your privilege and microaggressive behavior, exploring ethnic and cultural identities, engaging with history of white anti-racist and multicultural struggles for justice. So as I mentioned, the historical context of racism in education, take a deeper dive in that material, in the history, to develop your understanding. developing intersectional identity, building white anti-racist communities. Affinity groups are always good in this regard, and demonstrating accountability across race. So we can't afford to not change. And it's a mindset shift that, again, starts with us. And this is when you start to engage in this work, this is where you truly, truly start. And so the next strategy that I'm going to take us to is talking about white supremacy culture. And so we will now examine some of the tenets, first the definition and some of the tenets of white supremacy culture. And we'll use this as a strategy to reframe the ways in which it shows up in our everyday experience in education. So white supremacy culture is ingrained in the framework of most American social institutions and systems. White supremacy culture in this context is not about hate towards individuals, but rather it is about how white supremacy culture tenets show up in our everyday experience in our educational contexts. So you see on the screen, the definition is provided by Tima Akun and the late Kenneth Jones. Akun is a social justice advocate who works for dismantling racism works. So as we think about ourselves in our organizations, think about the ways in which it shows up. So in adult education, it's under or overrepresentation of certain ethnicities and program areas. It's hiring practices and predominantly white teachers in our institutions. It's culturally insensitive educational policies. So in the chat, based on this definition, and if you are familiar with the tenets, think about some other ways in which white supremacy culture shows up in your organization, if you are aware of any. And then I'll take us through the tenets of white supremacy culture, and then you may be able to identify more. So just top of mind. Okay, Laura says, we use the characteristics to talk about how our practices, policies, and procedures reflect white supremacy and sense of urgency. Todd says politics. Laura says academic norms. Power hoarding. Yes, absolutely. You must use direct deposit to work for the agency. Oh, got it. Okay. Those in charge, sometimes lack of multilingual resources, the idea of being loud when Hispanic, use of language, clothing, and hairstyles. Thank you, Nerva. Peg says dominance. Okay. Thank you all for sharing those. So here are the tenets of white supremacy culture. Again, these were taken from Kenneth Jones and Tima Akun from Dismantling Racism, a workbook for social change groups. So here we see white supremacy culture is very ingrained in our society, and that we're all guilty of upholding some of these tenets, regardless of race. Me, even as a Black woman, I often have to check myself because sometimes I tend to fall into these tenets. And so they say, when you know better, you do better. And it's time for us to do better. So I will not go into every tenet. However, I will provide the link of where you can find these tenets, and they are included in your PowerPoint. So you'll have access to all of them. But I'll go over a few of them. So for example, perfectionism. It's if I make a mistake, I am now defined by my mistake. Or sense of urgency. Everything has to be done yesterday, regardless of what it is. Power hoarding. I am in charge. I make all the decisions because I know what is best for everyone. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in charge. That's the stakeholder input is not valued. Only one right way. It speaks for itself. So even in our teaching standards, want us to celebrate multiple ways to represent learning. So let me drop the link in the chat of this so you all will have access to it. And so I want us to think about some ways in which we understand what white supremacy culture is. We see some of the different tenets that are on the screen, but now I want us to think about a racial justice practice in which we get to reframe some of these tenets. And when we see ourselves or experience ourselves upholding some of these tenets in our respective contexts, we have an opportunity to reframe our behavior, to reframe our thoughts, and to reframe our actions. So some of the ways in which we can, and this is a worksheet that you all will have access to in your in the PowerPoint. I'm also going to drop the link in the chat, but this is a worksheet where we have the tenets on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we have anti-racist culture. So when we think about perfectionism, so everything has to be perfect. You know, if it's not perfect, then I am a mistake. In anti-racist culture, or the way to reframe that, is to show compassion. Everyone makes mistakes. We're all human, but we have an opportunity to show some compassion when mistakes happen. Or instead of being defensive, so someone approaching you with constructive criticism, because again, we all want to have a mindset of growth. And so instead of being defensive, be a little vulnerable. Or individualism. So we work in an educational system that serves the unique needs of adult learners. So instead of being individualized, how about we collaborate and work together? Two minds is much better than one mind when it comes to creating change in this space. So here are some ways in which you can reframe some of the white supremacy culture tenets. And again, it's a reframing in your mind. It's a reframing in behavior. It's a reframing in action. So think about these in your respective context. And again, I invite you to use this worksheet in order to redo some reframing at your agency. And here's a blank worksheet. And here is when it's completely filled out. And again, these are my reframing. These are not the end all be all. You may have some other use of words or actions to reframe. And so the next strategy that I'm going to use is a anti-racist core framework for school transformation. So we talk about critical reflection and how that's important and how that starts with self. And then we talked about white supremacy culture within self, within the organization. But now we're moving towards school transformation. So this particular exercise or worksheet is something that I attained. I participated in a conference by Joe Trust. It's the Dismantling White Supremacy Culture conference that he upholds. He held every year, and we received this worksheet and actually completed it together. And so this really talks about your why. So starting with your core, your why at the school level. So why are we here? Why do we hold these beliefs? Why do we care? Why do we center our learners? So again, it's starting with our why as a school, and then we move out to our adults. So our administrators, our instructors, our support staff, everyone who is in charge with the educational experiences of our adult learners. Then we move to our students, and I'm talking about how, and then the what. What are our action steps? So here you can see this diagram filled out, and this is just an example. So on the left-hand side, we're talking about all of the ways in which we're upholding inequities in our education system. And then on the right-hand side, here are some of the ways in which, or the questions we should ask ourselves to critically reflect in how we can use this framework for school transformation. So again, starting with the why at the bottom. What do we believe? What and who do we value? Why are we here? Why do we care? Who are we here for? So an anti-racist approach would be, of course, anti-racism. We care about racial equity. We are here for cultural preservation. We're here for collectivism. Why do we care? It's because of collectivism, and then collaboration and coexistence. And then on the right-hand side, in the how can adult learning spaces leverage or manifest these beliefs towards anti-racism? What norms are necessary? What protocols will support this? How can ought help? How can we, anti-racist leadership, help? How can we respond to criticism? And then the how, we're thinking about our students and centering our students. So how can student learning structures leverage or manifest these beliefs? So we're looking at curriculum, we're looking at grading, if applicable, we're looking at pedagogy, we're looking at physical space, we're looking at rules, for example. And then the what anti-racist outcomes do we want / need to see? So I invite you all to take this back to your district or your agency and work on this core framework as a school collectively, and think about some of these questions and really, really evaluate, again, the core, and then the how when it relates to adults and students, and then the what outcomes and actions do you want to see? And here are some considerations. So some of the considerations for teachers in particular is, how can you build authentic relationships with your students of color? How are learners of color represented within your course curriculum? What steps can you take to address implicit bias you may have that you may hold in regard to learners? How will you lead a more diverse and equitable life? And then administrator considerations, what questions need to be asked of your learners of color? Who should be asking those questions? What systems need to be evaluated? So curriculum, PD, outreach, support, who can evaluate those systems, and so on and so forth. So again, you have access to the framework, you have access to the example, and then to the considerations. And so there's a blank document that you also have access to in order to complete this. And let me see, it's included in your PowerPoint. So you'll have access to this. And then the last tool or practice is, again, at the organizational level. But here is it's a justice education action plan. So it's the consideration of social, racial, and economic justice. And this was adapted from the National Education Association Racial Justice Resource Guide. And if you have not seen this guide, I definitely offer you the opportunity to look at it. It's a very robust guide. I'm going to drop this link in the chat. And I'm also going to drop a link in the chat for this document that we adapted. Oops, I actually clicked on it. I'll drop the link in the chat. 1 second. Let me get back to it. But this action plan takes you through a series of questions to begin planning your action steps in order to implement some of the, whatever your racial justice action plan ends up being. So again, we've examined the core framework for school transformation. Now we're going to be looking at this. And so if we were in a normal meeting setting, I would break you all into breakout groups to begin examining some of these questions. And so some of the questions is, really determining what the issue is at hand. So for example, you looked at your student ethnicity data, and you've looked at, there is an underrepresentation of a certain ethnicity, but there is a need for a particular program area. And you look at, let's say, your outreach efforts, and you see there's not a strong representation of this particular ethnicity in your outreach efforts. So then that could be an issue. So you'll write a brief statement about that. And then you would talk about, how does this plan support the student, the community, agency, consortium, and district goals? So you want to evaluate all goals to make sure that this action plan is aligning to those particular goals. And then look at your current realities. What opportunities exist now versus what do you want to achieve, but then also examining what challenges currently exist. And then the action steps you will take. And then one key point to this action plan is to make sure that you have some type of measurement in place in order to measure the change that is either occurring or maybe not occurring as of right now. But you want to make sure that you have some measurements in place to determine effectiveness of this particular plan. So again, you have this resource at your disposal, as well as the National Education Association Racial Justice Resource Guide. And it is K-12 centric. However, there are some elements of it that can be applied to adult education. And then on the last slide, so here are some helpful resources in live website exploration. So here are some of the resources that I personally use when I am preparing for a session such as this, or I'm helping someone do some discovery work or figure out how they can implement racial justice practices, et cetera. So I offer these resources to you as well, so that you can go and explore them and really figure out what will work for yourself as your individual when you're doing your critical reflection, when you're thinking about the classroom space, your organization, as well as your district, the system as a whole. And then here are some helpful books that I have engaged in. All of these are racial justice oriented books. Again, if you are not familiar with any of these books or have not read them, I invite you to do so. And then now we're at the point where we have reflection as well as questions. So as we are looking at questions, and if you do have questions, type them in the chat or in the Q&A section. But I would like you all to share a key takeaway that you have for this particular experience today. What's the key takeaway from your experience? Okay, you're welcome for sharing all of the resources, absolutely. Moni says, I have used one, but look forward to exploring and quite likely sharing others. Any familiar with great number of books? Okay. And then the components of anti-racist culture, using these frameworks to systemically look, plan, and work towards change. Resources I can explore and use later. Texas anti-racist core framework. I like the breakdown presented in the construct of organizations, the need for change. So many great takeaways, yes. Be more intentional about anti-racist work, the reflection on white supremacy culture, the worksheets for organization, self-reflection. Absolutely. So thank you all for sharing your key takeaways. And I hope that you continue to reflect upon what was shared today, as well as remember your intention. So as you have access to the PowerPoint, you'll see that poem by Mickey Scott Bay, and remember the intentions that you set for this experience this afternoon, but also hopefully they'll carry you into your respective contexts. I'm going to go into the Q&A now. I see that there are a couple. How can I incorporate equity in the classroom is one question, and how do I collect data with a justice orientation? So how can I incorporate equity in the classroom? I would say for Jackie, if you're still here, definitely the strategies that are listed here, but truly it goes down to you examining your students and who they are, where they come from, and really that building relationships is very pivotal in understanding where they come from and what their needs are. Because like we mentioned, not everyone has the same needs. And so one of the ways in which you can incorporate equity in the classroom is to understand who they are, and vice versa, them understanding who you are, but then also give your students an opportunity to understand who each other are. Because when we're thinking about the sharing of culture and ethnicities and identity, our students should have the opportunity to learn about one another. So whether you incorporate, let's say, a research project where students are sharing whom they are and also learning about others, giving them an opportunity to do a presentation about, their culture or their experience, etc. So again, the relationship building, that's where it starts, and understanding who your students are. And to collect data with justice orientation, whatever data you have available, just making sure that it's that you're looking at it from an equity lens and that it's representative of all your students. And then when you're collecting data, again, making sure that the data that you are collecting is representative of all of your students, and including elements of equity, justice, all of those elements, culture, etc. And what suggestions do you have for people just beginning the DEI journey? My suggestion would be to start with self and to really do the critical reflection using some of those questions that I posed. You can also do an implicit bias test where you will be able to understand what your biases are, and then really understand how you can reframe those biases or become more aware of them. Also engage in PD, whether it's provided by your particular agency or district, or also outside. There are great professional development opportunities for DEI work that you can participate in on your own time. So again, I would begin with starting with self and critical reflection, engaging in professional development, and also taking the implicit bias test. And I am curious how equity is attained without forcing individual choice. Different people choose different things. So holding space for everyone, holding space for those who may not choose to engage. They do have that right, but then also letting them sit with that discomfort and allowing them to experience what they need to experience, but don't close the door just because you have some people who are not choosing to engage. But it's all of our responsibilities in education or in the world. We all are responsible for enacting change and creating inclusive environments for our students. So those are all of the questions that I see, and I see a lot of thank yous in the chat. So thank you all very much. The time is now 11:59. So that is my time. In the PowerPoint that you all receive, you have my contact information. It's my work email as well as my USC email. So if you have any additional questions, or if you want to further the conversation or even partner in this work, feel free to reach out. I'm always willing to engage in conversation with anyone who wants to. As I said before, I am not an expert. I continue to engage in critical reflection as well as continue to learn. So this is an ongoing process for me, and I invite anyone to collaborate with me. So thank you all very much for your time and your participation this afternoon, and I will turn it over to Chris. Thank you.
Veronica, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, excellent engagement and participation. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. As a reminder, this presentation, as well as the supporting documents for it or presentation for it, will be posted to coabe.org within 24 hours. So that will be available as well. If you could take a minute to answer our single poll question that we have up. And once you've done that, you're free to go. Once again, I thank you, Veronica, for the presentation. It was awesome. And I thank everyone for joining us today. Hope everyone has a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you,
Bye.
Veronica.